So what are the top three products that Cuba exports right now? So we are talking tobacco, nickel ore, and hard liquor, specifically rum. You see, the byproducts from sugar production can be used to make rum, but without electricity, you cannot produce sugar. So sugar is out of the picture. And the total value of all these products combined, their entire export revenue is barely $1 billion. Because all its other industries just do not have a market internationally. They cannot sell them. Right. On the other hand, Cuba is heavily dependent on imports for everything from energy and food rations to all sorts of daily necessities. So that $1 billion is obviously nowhere near enough. So Cuba is a country with a truly staggering trade deficit. So now Cuba cannot. Well, it is completely unable to generate any significant foreign currency from sugar to manage its affairs anymore. Since 2021, Cuba has failed to meet its sugar export targets, right? For the whole year, China imported 210,000 tons of Cuban sugar. And 2021, well, that was actually the best year they would have had in a long, long time. And after 2021, the numbers just kept dropping. They could not even maintain the agreed upon total of 400,000 tons anymore. And the rum supply agreement with the EU, that also took a massive effort just to get the shipments out. Because they can use the sugarcane bagasse to make it. So, my friends, as you can all see, this just goes to show how incredibly important it is to have a self-sufficient, independent, self-sustaining system. That is truly more precious than gold. So for today's live stream, I want to give you all a special recommendation for a book. So what is the book called? It is called Agriculture Studies, 大斋, a history of the 大斋 movement. I am telling you, I really, really recommend you all take a good look at this book. Where were we? Okay, so since the channel for trading their own products for foreign currency and consumer goods is now cut off, what is the plan? So they had to find other ways to get foreign currency, right? And so in recent years, Cuba has mainly relied on three channels. The first one is remittances. The second is tourism. And the third is a dual-track economic system. So what exactly are these so-called overseas remittances? So right now, you have got over 2 million Cuban expats living abroad, and they are sending cash back home, specifically US dollars. And to put it bluntly, these expats, they are mostly people who fled the country back in the day. So, they are pretty hostile towards the current Cuban government. It is just that, they have relatives back home. So after making money in the US, they will do their best to help out their family there. For instance, in 2019, Cuba received over $3.1 billion in remittances. And that is really the reason why groups like the one Marco Rubio represents the Cuban exiles in the US. The reason they are so resilient is that their ties to people back in Cuba are incredibly tight, allowing them to stay informed over the long term. So about the living situation in Cuba, what is really interesting is that even though the US has long maintained a financial blockade against the country, so while banks in the two countries cannot send money to each other, commercial flights are running just fine. So these remittances sent to Cuba, they can just be brought in by people carrying cash. All you have to do is bring in a little extra each time. The connections are just that tight. They are well aware of the situation Cuba has been in since 1990, right? The massive economic crisis it faced. So they have always felt they had a chance to go back and be the ones on top. They have always held out great hope for subverting the Cuban regime. They see how badly Cuba's economy is doing, right? Everyone wants to live the American dream just like me. So I could totally go back and lead them, could not. And to be honest, back in the 80s and 90s, that bunch of people who fled with the Chang bandits, after they came back to the mainland to invest, some of them had this idea too. Yeah, a lot of them did. They felt that after all these years, the mainland's development just could not compare to what they had achieved outside. So if I come back, I would be qualified to be the leader too. But in recent years, you definitely do not see many people with that kind of thinking anymore. Because after they came back, they saw they absolutely had no chance at that. So this is, how should I put it? This is really just a kind of, a shift. All right, so after the special period, they implemented a dual-track system. Basically, the US dollar could not be freely circulated. But then starting in the 90s, it became freely convertible. Again, you could only exchange it for the convertible peso at a 1-to-1 rate. It was basically the equivalent of the foreign exchange certificates we had in the early days of China's reform and opening up, right? And you could not just spend these convertible pesos anywhere. They were only accepted in tourist areas, at special foreign currency shops, and in show at hospitals. And even in those places, what you could buy was still heavily restricted. And what is even more absurd, starting in 93. So to get these foreign currencies back, because they introduced this foreign exchange peso, this convertible peso, this foreign exchange certificate, so a lot of people just were not willing to exchange their US dollars anymore. All right, so we have got the deal sorted for the spinach date seed and lily ball paste. It is buy one, get one free. And for those of you who bought it last time, it is buy one, get three. Yep, buy one, get three free. All right, that is all settled. So you guys can go ahead and ask customer service about it. All right, and for the book, that was out of stock earlier. The History of the Learn from Dajai in Agriculture campaign. We have just restocked it. So that really got on my nerves. I am a little ticked off. Because even before I went live, I knew this book would sell out fast. Like the moment I put it up, so I specifically asked them, how much stock do you have? They told me they had 600 copies in stock. Plenty to go around, absolutely no worries. That is why I started promoting it. But then, after selling just a few dozen, no, maybe 100 or so copies, I do not know, like 50 or 100. And it just showed up as out of stock. Stuff like this is just so frustrating. All right, they are back in stock, so go grab yours now. Anyway, it is 50 yuan a copy, and it is a pretty substantial read. Oh, and look, it is packed with content. It has got pictures, you see, photos, introductions. It is all really well done. I think it is a really great deal for a book that helps you understand that period of history. All right, let us get back to it. This one, that is the red one. Why says, I hope Cuba does not have a regime change. Hey, do not you worry, I will get to that at the end. Just be patient. Right. And you know what the craziest part was? Some of the locals were reluctant to exchange their US dollars for these convertible pesos. So starting in 1993, in order to get those US dollars circulating among the public back, so Cuba copied the model of the old friendship stores, which were originally just for diplomats, and opened up hundreds of what they called dollar stores all across the country. So what does this all mean? So what does that mean? Now hearing this, I know a lot of you who have always had a soft spot for Cuba might be feeling pretty disappointed. So to get these dollars back into the system, these dollar stores only accept US dollars. Basically, if you have got us dollars, I do not care where you got them from. I really do not care where they came from. Basically, as long as you have US dollars, you can go into these dollar stores and buy whatever you want. And the stuff you find in these dollar stores, it is way more abundant than in the regular shops outside. I mean, can you believe this is how they are running things? And this whole system, it ended up creating two distinct classes right there in Cuba. One group consists of counter-revolutionaries who fled to foreign countries, like the United States. The other group is made up of families who have always stayed in the country, who are all in Cuba, working to build up the new socialist regime. And now you have those with relatives in the US. They can get US dollars. They can buy all sorts of good stuff. Meanwhile, the ones who are truly wholeheartedly committed to the Cuban Revolution and socialism, they cannot get their hands on anything. It's not that, right? It's not that just like the real stores. It is like the old saying goes, an early revolution is worse than the late one, and the late one is worse than being a counter-revolutionary. So it is basically encouraging people to flee. And because of this, right there in Cuba, it has created two distinct social classes. And that is a really tough thing to say. But what can we do? Why does it have to be this way? Yeah. Why does it have to be this way? I mean, poverty stifles ambition. It is as simple as that. Right. So what is the other source of income? And that would be tourism. The tourism industry, well, it basically brings in about $3 billion US dollars in revenue for Cuba each year. Yeah, around 3 billion. So after 2010, when Cuba's sugar industry and its economy in general just could not get off the ground due to energy shortages and all sorts of other problems, so it took a huge leap and pivoted towards what? It pivoted to tourism, specifically by building dedicated tourist zones. They do not let you wander around other parts of Cuba, but instead, they will just set aside a stretch of beach, build some hotels, and let foreign tourists vacation there. It is just like what North Korea did with the Mount Kamgang tourist zone. And this trend really picked up after 2017 with the Cuban government pouring more and more money into tourism. In 2020, 21, and 2022, a third of the government's fiscal spending was dedicated to investing in tourism and real estate development. But where is the problem in that? And the same problem happened all over again. So, after 2010, Cuba discovered that tourism was a major way to solve its foreign exchange problem. So, the country, just like it did with the sugar industry back in the day, poured all its energy into tourism. And the things were going great guns from 2010. But then, what happened in 2021? The pandemic hit. And what happened to Cuba's tourism industry? It was completely wiped out. It was basically cut in half. And on top of that, the tourism industry just could not bounce back after the pandemic. First, a massive number of flights from the US to Cuba were cancelled. And then you have these remittances sent by people, which are a major source of US dollars. In just 1 year, they plummeted by 54%. This situation lasted for 2 years, wiping out over $3 billion US dollars, just like that. And at the same time, its tourism industry came to a standstill. So how big did Cuba's tourism industry get in the years before the pandemic? Well, it was welcoming over 4 million international tourists every year. For a country like Cuba, for a country with only 10 million people, that is pretty impressive. But then, bam, in 2020, that number plummeted to under 1 million. And even by 2024 or 2025, the number of tourist arrivals is only expected to be around 2 million. And with the current tensions, well, that goes without saying, this has caused tourism revenue to plummet by 2/3. So just think about it. What does Cuba's entire economic structure even consist of? There is only one. And this is not just about going all in. It is not even a question of going all in. Its entire economic structure has only one investor, just one. And that is the government. The state sector doing all the investing. So as long as the state sector makes the right investments, so it looked great from 2010 to 2020 with over 4 million inbound tourists every year. But the real question is, what if you bet on the wrong horse? Or let us say, after a period of testing this investment direction, say 10 or 15 years down the line, you discover that something unexpected has happened. They poured their investments into tourism. But after 2020, the tourism industry could not expand its output. So what happened to all those assets? They were basically built for nothing. And as a result, Cuba plunged into an economic crisis right after 2020. So what this all means is that Cuba's economic model just is not suited for today's highly complex economies. The source of its investment is too narrow, coming only from the state sector. So as a result, for any given period, they tend to have only one or very few investment directions. So it is falling into the same trap as the sugar era. Its economic structure is just too one-dimensional. So if any one of these few sectors runs into trouble, the entire economy loses its momentum for growth. And the country's foreign exchange earnings, they are toast. If you think about it, has not this kind of thing happened to us before as well? With a population of just over 10 million, you can basically think of Cuba as a large, mid-sized city. You know, there was a time when some people in the city loved to use these top-down directive ways to develop the economy. So it is like an official goes, I have made up my mind. Everyone in our county is going to plant this one cash crop. It is profitable, right? Right? So what happens is everyone just coasts along. And then the market shifts. And BAM, just like that. This year's income plummets. But if you apply that same logic to Cuba, you will see. Once they made that wrong bet, their economy just completely lost its momentum. So the country's foreign exchange earnings, all of that just collapsed. And Cuba, well, it is a country with a shrinking industrial sector. Yeah, a shrinking industrial sector. So what does it mainly rely on? They rely on imported consumer goods to meet basic domestic demand. As a result, for the past 5 years, Cuba has been facing a chronic shortage of consumer goods. In the past, Cuba also had a pretty significant black market, a really big one. You need both a plan and a market. But now consumer goods in Cuba are so scarce that there is almost nothing left to supply the black market. All right, so after 2020, Cuba saw a massive wave of people fleeing. Those who had the means to escape were all leaving the country. And within just 3 to 4 years, a quarter of the population just packed up and left. Is it just me, or is there a lot of background noise? And this quarter of the population, they were the ones who actually had the means to get out. Right? So who were these people? Well, they were the skilled professionals, the ones with knowledge and expertise. And this in turn meant that within Cuba, there was no one left with the skills to maintain the country's power plants. So they suffered a massive loss of technical maintenance personnel for things like the power grid and electrical systems. All right, so by 2023, Cuba found itself in a bind. It had no foreign currency to import new equipment, a shortage of fertilizer, a labor shortage, partly because, a lot of the workforce had just left, and a lack of skilled technicians by 2023. The general manager of production for the Cuban sugar industry himself admitted it. He said a major reason for the crisis in the Cuban sugar sector is first and foremost financial difficulties. Second, the labor shortage caused by emigration. And what about this immigration? Well, it is because too many people are running away. They have all left. Right. Okay. So what was the final straw? That would be Venezuela. Right, Venezuela. So after 2000, Cuba was actually getting a huge amount of help from Venezuela now. And on that note, I would say this so-called Cuba-Venezuela alliance is actually a really important point to look at. I am talking about the alliance between Cuba and Venezuela. Now, Tuan Zhuo often says that just chanting slogans is useless. But the thing is, Cuba's oil and energy problems, the energy crisis they faced after the Soviet Union collapsed. And wow, that really did provide some relief for a long time. Even if it was just temporary, it was all thanks to Castro's heroic image that really did solve the problem for a very long time. So, starting in October 2000, Chavez, who deeply admired Castro, signed an integration agreement between Cuba and Venezuela. This established the Oil for Services alliance between Cuba and Venezuela. Wow, this was a truly genius invention. So, what was at the core of this agreement? In return, Venezuela would supply Cuba with 3,000 barrels of oil per day at a preferential price. So, in return, Cuba provides Venezuela with technical personnel to support education, healthcare, sports, and scientific and technological research. In 2025, this agreement was upgraded. So what is upgrade? Cuba sent 30,000 medical personnel to Venezuela. In Venezuela, they would operate 1,000 free medical service centers. They are responsible for training 50,000 Venezuelan medical personnel and providing medical services to 100,000 Venezuelans. On top of that, they also help train 40,000 Venezuelan surgeons. All right? So in exchange, Venezuela exports 90,000 barrels of crude oil to Cuba every day at a preferential price. So how much is 90,000 barrels of crude oil? Well, that is equivalent to 1/3 of Cuba's total energy consumption, and a whopping 2/3 of its oil consumption. And just like that, most of Cuba's problems were solved. All right, so then, in 2013, when the current president, Maduro, visited Cuba, the two sides signed another 51 cooperation projects. So Venezuela provided Cuba with $2 billion in financial aid. In return, Cuba increased its service workforce in Venezuela to 60,000 people. So, on one hand, this really eased Cuba's energy crisis. You see, while the oil Venezuela exported to Cuba only accounted for 5.3% of its total production, it was sold at a price far below the international market. On top of that, they provided 20,000 to 26,000 barrels of oil for free every day. That is a subsidy to Cuba worth $6 to $8 billion annually. And what else? The doctors, teachers, and other professionals that Cuba sends to Venezuela, they are not working for free. They are there to earn money, to bring in foreign currency. In 2018, Cuba's foreign exchange earnings from these professional services hit a whopping $11.8 billion. And the vast majority of that came from Venezuela. Of course, there was also the income from Cuban mercenaries fighting in various wars, which made up a portion of it. But the vast majority came from Venezuela. So their oil problem was solved, and their foreign exchange income was taken care of, right? And that is how Cuba just kept muddling through. But then, what happened in January? The United States basically took Maduro hostage and seized control of Venezuela's oil exports. So, what was the result? Not a single drop of oil for Cuba. And at the same time, on January the 29th, Trump signed an executive order threatening to impose tariffs on goods from any country that provides oil to Cuba. But in reality, this just established a new round of oil sanctions against Cuba. On top of that, the war in Iran is raging. And pretty soon, they are going to be hitting a few more oil fields. And that, of course, drove up global oil prices, which really hit Cuba hard. Shout out to Max, and Official. Welcome aboard, our newest captain, the 10th one for today. Welcome. And this left Cuba unable to afford fuel. And well, unable to generate electricity either. And just this year, in the first 3 months of 2024, there have already been 4 nationwide blackouts. And the one just the other day, on March the 12th, that was the worst one yet. To this day, many areas still have not had their power restored. They're only staying afloat thanks to those few solar farms from China. But solar power only accounts for 10% of its total electricity generation. How much can that really support? Plus, there is the whole weather issue. It cannot generate power at night, and who knows how their energy storage is holding up, right? Okay, so it is a combination of 3 main factors: fuel shortages, aging equipment, and the brain drain of skilled professionals. I am a bit late to the stream today. So in Cuba, from 2021 to now, they have had massive blackouts every single year. This year alone, they have had 4 major blackouts in just 3 months. Meanwhile, with the rising gas prices, many Cubans have stopped driving. They are now riding bikes or even taking horse-drawn carriages out on the streets. I mean, think about it. If you cannot even guarantee a stable power supply and transportation, how are you supposed to develop your tourism industry? So the tourism industry just could not recover. And just like that, it becomes a vicious cycle. So all four pillars, remittances, tourism, overseas services, and oil, have collapsed. Instead, they built a whole bunch of high-end hotels in tourist areas just sitting there taunting the Cuban people. I mean, look at you. You are a socialist regime. And yet you are building all these hotels for tourists from the decadent capitalist West. Meanwhile, your manufacturing sector collapses. And, well, the people's morale just shatters. And then, well... agriculture was also in the gutter. So, yeah, from the lessons of Cuba, I think there are 2 points that are really worth paying attention to. The first point, as I just mentioned, is the importance of self-reliance and hard work. You have to build your own self-sustaining system. Building up your own, at least a basic circular system that is truly more precious than gold. Is not it? Over-relying on external powers or becoming too dependent on a single industry. That is just a fatal mistake. Someone in the chat just said, if only Cuba had enough energy, then that, well, for fuck's sake, you think Venezuela did not have enough energy? And what about the Soviet Union? You think they did not have enough energy? So what was the deal with that? So when it comes to relying on external powers for these two crucial things, your livelihood and your security, if you ever let them fall into someone else's hands. The Soviet Union was the one that relied on external powers for its bread and butter, right? And Venezuela, well, they became dependent on external forces for their military might, right? Relying too heavily on external powers, that is just a fatal mistake. Look at Cuba. First, it was dependent on the United States. After the revolution, it became reliant on the Soviet Union. Even though he did not want to be dependent and truly desired independence, when it came to the actual execution and pacing, that is where the leadership fell short. They tried for a mere 3 years, and when they hit a snag, they just gave up, right? From 1961 to 1963, Fidel was pushing for industrialization. And it might not have even been 3 full years. Just think about it. The immense difficulties we faced from 1959 to 1962. And look, as I have said time and again, there were definitely decision-making errors, from the top all the way down to the bottom. But just because this was mishandled does not mean Chairman Mao's insistence on independence and self-reliance, on exploring how to build communism based on China's specific national conditions, was wrong. And it does not mean that our goal of achieving rapid development by relying on ourselves, not on foreign aid, was wrong. So, is the spirit itself wrong? Ultimately, thank goodness, we did not end up like Cuba, getting discouraged after one setback from 1959 to 1962, and immediately running to cozy up to the CMEA. Right? The generation of our predecessors, those born from the 1940s to the 1960s, they endured all the hardships for the generations that followed. Whereas 2 generations endured the hardships meant for 3, even 5 generations. Ultimately, they managed to establish their own basic industrial and circulation systems, which has now been proven. If they had been the ones to endure this hardship, we would have been finished long ago. You see, launching a revolution is a high difficulty task. But what comes after the revolution, how to build a new world, is also an incredibly difficult task. It is not like some people imagine, where everything is just fine and dandy after the revolution. I mean, look at a super charismatic leader like Castro. In the end, you start to wonder if you were wrong, right? When faced with setbacks, you can only bow to reality. So, you tell me, when Chairman Mao faced such a massive setback from 1959 to 1962, do you think he ever doubted he was wrong? Of course. He must have. So, in the dead of night, when you are asking yourself those tough questions, that pain, how do you overcome that kind of inner anguish? How do you overcome that self-doubt and keep pushing forward for the sake of the long-term goal? How do you steer reality in a direction that is beneficial for the revolution? And for building a new world. And that is not something you can achieve just by shouting slogans. It requires an iron will and incredibly complex, sophisticated maneuvering. You are bound to make mistakes along the way. The real question is, when you do, can you find your way back from them? You see, after Castro's efforts to break free from Soviet dependence failed, the country's entire industrialization suffered a massive setback. And then, what happens? They turn around and rely on what? On the oil alliance with Venezuela, a completely contingent factor. So when the Soviet Union fell apart, they got hammered in the 90s. Sigh and when Venezuela's situation changed, They ended up taking the same beating in the 2020s that they did back in the 90s. See what I mean? All day long, just running your mouth. Look, if you do not want to listen, I will just block you. It is as simple as that. So for this user, Southern Anhui Blossom Fall, boom, instant block and mute. That is not so simple either, right? It is better for us to just go our separate ways. You are not happy. I am not happy. So why bother? All right. So some people, they ask, why did not we use foreign capital in the first 30 years and not using the Soviet aid, right? When Chairman Mao heard that, Khrushchev wanted to set up a long-wave radio station and a joint fleet. Was it really necessary to be so furious? Was it worth it to ruin our relationship with the Soviet Union over just one thing? If we had not soured our relationship with the Soviet Union, just think how much help we could have gotten from them. Honestly, a huge shout out to Savage Orc Warbor. Thanks, Savage Orc Warbor, my old captain, for renewing your subscription. Honestly, folks, whether it is in your daily work or just how you handle things in life, as someone who has been around the block, let me give you a piece of advice. Now, I know that how people get along with each other and how countries deal with each other are two completely different things. But still, I think there are some lessons we can learn from each other here. So what is the principle here? Remember this, whether it is dependence on an opponent or a friend for a country, relying on anyone, be it an enemy or an ally, is always dangerous. When you depend on a friend for too long, they are not your friend anymore. They become your master. You have to remember what I am telling you. Do not just think, oh, we are on great terms right now, and that is the end of it. What really matters is when you start to become dependent on him. What does it mean to always go by his way? Or whatever, after a while. Your status in their eyes, you see, was originally on equal footing. Your status as a friend slowly diminishes. And as that status drops little by little, what do you become? You are no longer a friend, but a servant. And after you become a servant, there's another possibility you become an enemy, right? That is spot on. So, in those first 30 years, did we, because of this firm resolve, this desire for complete independence and self-reliance, and that includes now, right? Even today, have we ever, in our firm, resolved to achieve independence and self-reliance, gone too far, and done some absurd things? It is just like in the history of our Learn from Dazai in Agriculture campaign, how that movement eventually went off track, how it went astray in its mid stages. So let me ask you, does this kind of situation exist? Absolutely. And there are plenty of them. It is just a lack of experience. But to not rely on others and instead build your own independent, self-sufficient economic system. Building an independent, comprehensive industrial system, that was absolutely the right path to take, was not it. In agriculture, we emphasize the Dazai spirit. A lot of people found that laughable. But looking back now, they did not understand that without effective division of labor, all that effort was just wasted. But just look at Cuba today. They thought they could just specialize, right? And they did not even bother to solve their own food problem. And what was the end result? In the end, they found they did not even have any work to divide. So, what is the Dazai spirit? It is all about why we had advocated for food as the key link back then. It was because of our level of productivity. It is underdeveloped, The conditions for a division of labor just were not there. A lot of people talk about the division of labor, right? But that is looking back on it now. Back then, the conditions for that kind of specialization just were not there, right? You have not even solved the transportation problem. So, no matter how tough things are in any given place, what is the very first thing you need to do? You have to reclaim wastelands, prioritize grain production, and secure your own food supply first. The goal was to stop relying on the state for grain, making the resolved grain a safety net for the entire region. Once you have that safety net, right, you go all out and push everything humanly possible to the absolute limit. If my region really cannot produce any more grain, I am just a little short. So the country will come and sell us some, instead of in a situation where there is no detailed division of labor, when even transportation is a problem. Every single place thinking, hey, we have a comparative advantage here. So I will just produce this and that, but not grain. Then everyone can just live off the state's resolved grain. And you have not even sorted out the transportation yet. Just think about how much grain gets wasted during the shipping process, right? So the Dazai spirit was held in such high regard back then. What was the key role it was meant to play? Look at Xi'an AT Dazai in those terrible geographical conditions. In a place with such poor land, we were able to, through rational organization and a massive input of labor, we embraced collectivism using rational planning to maximize people's subjective initiative. Even under such harsh conditions, we could achieve basic self-sufficiency, right? We could basically feed ourselves. I can build a red flag canal. And if Dazai can do it, what does that prove? And the vast majority of the country could achieve this. At that point, by using this method, most regions across the nation could basically solve their own food security problem. Then, by redistributing grain from the more prosperous regions to those with genuine shortages, the entire nation could finally secure its food supply. Only on this foundation can you then decide to increase the industrial workforce in certain areas, right? Because the industrial workforce does not produce food, they consume it. In every single place, the local people have to be able to feed themselves. Then, from that pool, you can find some farmers. Well, you convert those farmers into workers. Once you have an industrial workforce, then you can import and develop equipment to achieve technological breakthroughs.